Hello there, welcome to saberduelgaming, where we always take the high ground. If there's one franchise that truly overlaps my love for modern and retro gaming, it's Resident Evil. The first two games in this series I ever played were Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 on the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation respectively. These games were such a stark contrast to the cartoony and simplistic games I'd played until this point. And quite recently, both of these games have been given the remake treatment. The most obvious change was the dramatic improvement to the graphics. However, there was also a fundamental change to the gameplay, which while some loved, others didn't. However, what's often forgotten is that way before Resident Evil 2 or 3 were given the remake, the original Resident Evil, with its corny acting and bad dialogue, was given a 2002 update on the Nintendo GameCube. The graphics and gameplay were a massive leap forward, but with talk of yet another remake of this same game, I thought now would be a good time to do a retro review of Resident Evil 2002. From the very beginning, the difficulty menu does a good job of letting you know the world you're in for. We then move on to select between two of the most popular characters in the whole franchise, Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield. These are characters we come back to over and over again, and as in most Resident Evil games, it does play out differently depending on who you pick. For those that played the original version of Resident Evil, the opening cinematic really sets the tone in the difference between this game and the original. Whereas the original used actors and corny dialogue and, quite frankly, god-awful acting in general, this plays out in a far more realistic tone. Yes, there's not actors, we're seeing CGI characters, but quite frankly, they're more believable than the actors were in the original. And the cast of characters we're introduced to so quickly in this game is fantastic. It's not just Chris and Jill who you'll be playing as, but also Barry and of course Wesker, who we'll come to know quite well. We're also presented with a number of really inspiring and terrifying antagonists. We have the zombie dogs that we would come to see throughout the franchise, and of course the classic zombies themselves. And in this game, they don't just appear in places, they absolutely erupt onto the scene, and each time you see them they have a completely different and unique look. We're also introduced in this remake version to what will become known as the Crimson Heads, and these Crimson Heads are zombies that you've already killed, but throughout the game will stay there, and you're never going to know which one will suddenly burst back to life, far more ferocious than before and requiring you to put it down for good, unless you're smart enough to carry some kerosene and burn it to a crisp the first time you see it. And as the game goes on, you'll see giant mutated animals and creatures so twisted you'll be begging for Crimson Heads. But how does the game actually play out? Well, for those who never really played any of the original Resident Evil games, it's quite a unique experience. It's not an action game in the strictest sense. It's of course labelled as survival horror, but the way survival horror games have evolved over the years, they've become so heavily reliant on jump scares. Something simply jumps out to give you a fright. But that's not how this game does it. It slowly creates a paced feeling of dread and terror. We often find notes or documents telling us about the monsters we're going to be confronted with way before we see them, and this really builds up a sense of foreboding and fear for what we're about to face. Most people by now are familiar with the need to conserve ammo, to be able to think carefully about where you save. But there's other aspects that make Resident Evil so different to other games of this kind. You're constantly being presented with riddles and puzzles to try and solve, and whilst none of these are the most complicated, the fact that you're having to understand these whilst also wondering what monster is going to come around the corner next to bite your face off, it makes it challenging enough. But the biggest aspect of gameplay that makes this Resident Evil game, like some of the other original Resident Evil games, so different is the fixed camera positions. This is something that a lot of people really struggled with, as it does affect the controls as well as your inability to see around corners. It takes a little getting used to, but once you do, it works just fine, and the sense of fear and anxiety it brings to the game is truly breathtaking. The mostly fixed camera angles also allow the game to have probably one of its strongest benefits, which is some of the most beautiful and haunting graphics I've ever seen in a video game. Every single inch of this stylized mansion and the twisted experiments happening in the laboratories below has a breathtaking beauty to it, even if it's also horrifying. And then finally we come to the last aspect of the game to review, which is the storyline. And the only thing I can say is this is one of the greatest stories ever told. And I don't mean in gaming, I mean ever. If the brainless but entertaining and action-packed Resident Evil films, or the truly offensive Netflix series, had even a fraction of the story elements from this game, they'd be winning Oscars by now. So the question is, how was it received back in 2002? Well, being made specifically for the GameCube, this was one of the first times we got such a dark and brooding game on a Nintendo console. Yes, Resident Evil 2 had come out on the Nintendo 64, but by the time it was released on that console, it was a relatively dated game. With a few exceptions, Nintendo's consoles usually got more of the cartoon, bright, colourful games, so for a completely different take on the Resident Evil franchise to be released exclusively on the GameCube, at least at first, was something of a coup. The average score for this game were in the low 90s. There were some as low as 8 out of 10, but on the whole, they were between 89% to 91%, with the occasional A- for those that want to rate games in a little bit more of a convoluted way. Shane Satterfield of GameSpot magazine described it as quite clearly the greatest game that the franchise had to offer. And Jess Bickman of NGC magazine stated that the game was so visually rich that just moving on to the next scene to see the newest environment was an experience to be treasured. Whilst a great deal of praise was given to the graphics, which were leaps and bounds ahead of anything else seen at this time, but also for the audio. Whilst there was some mild criticism for the dialogue, with some people feeling that whilst it was a massive leap forward from the original, it still had some slightly hokey moments. But overall, there was a great deal of praise for the now iconic music, but also for the basic sound effects littered throughout the game. Even something as simple as footsteps was noted to have numerous different sound bites, making sure that every new experience felt real, rather than just a number of clips in an audio file. There was one negative, however. Whilst the game was reviewed and generally received beautifully, it didn't sell as well as they expected, and this was one of the reasons that the move to the more action-based Resident Evil games we saw afterwards was taken. So how does it hold up to modern scrutiny? Well, this is where I'm really going to have to put forward a few strong opinions of mine. You see, when Resident Evil 2 was recently remade, along with Resident Evil 3, I was originally quite excited. I loved those games. But it wasn't just the graphics that were improved. It wasn't a matter of a update on a fantastic game I loved. They fundamentally changed the way it played. And whilst that may have been more successful and may have been more popular now, it just wasn't what I wanted in a Resident Evil game. This Resident Evil updated everything that needed updating, but left the core feeling of the game still there. That said, I understand why sometimes in remaking a game you have to make these tweaks, and in fairness, Resident Evil 2 and 3 had dated quite poorly. They did need a remake. But to hear that a remake was due of this Resident Evil game is fundamentally silly to me. If this game was made now, just like this, I would consider it one of the most impressive games I'd ever seen. Yes, you could easily make some minor improvements to the graphics, but would I be blown away by those changes, like I was when I first played this? No, not really. The reality is, at a certain point, we hit a level where graphical improvements went from being a massive leap forward to being a minor improvement, and any change to this game would only be a minor improvement. The only reason I can understand why they would want to remake this game is to change the gameplay, and that just feels like a crime, especially in this game. I digress away from that because I know this is meant to be a review of this game, but I don't feel like I could do this game justice without pointing out what a waste of time remaking it would feel. The fact is, this game is perfect. It's not just my love of retro games that makes me say this. This isn't perfect for a retro game. It's perfect full stop. Replaying this game from scratch for this review, I fell in love all over again, and I have no qualms in giving this the highest score I've ever given. It's a 10 out of 10 for Resident Evil 2002.